we're going to talk about how to gesso panels. I have some masonite panels here. I also have some wood panels and gesso, and the tools that we're going to need. So you need a little bit of water, your gesso, your brushes, I'll talk about that in a second, and some sandpaper. I'll talk about that more as well. I tend to use a variety of different brushes for gessoing, but I have found over the years that softer bristle brushes work a little bit better because you don't get really big streaks in the gesso when you're painting it out. It is all personal preference, of course, and I like to have a variety of different sizes. So this really large one I found at Home Depot for pretty cheap, and I figured I'd give it a try, and it worked really well for large canvases. Alright, for your sandpaper, you're going to need a sanding block. It's one of these rubber things, and it holds the paper on with these spikes. And I'll show you how to put the paper on that in a second. So the paper that I'm using is 150, and I buy it in these sheets like this because it fits better on there, although this is the wrong size, I think. I usually try to find ones that fit on here pretty well, so I'll have to cut it down. So basically, to cut it down, I put it on there, and then I'll just cut it along there to make it fit. Alright, so I just drew a line along there and cut it with some scissors. You don't want to use any nice scissors, just use some cheap ones you have laying around. So let's get the sandpaper on here. So you have to really kind of leverage it to lift it up and get the paper on and off. So we're going to try to get it in the middle. You want to make sure to have enough to wrap it up. Okay, so I just pressing with my palm there, lifting up, folding that over. Once you get it kind of in place, and you push this down and push it even more, and then you want to make sure to push this all the way to get it tight. You want it to be pretty tight on there. So again, we'll make sure it's tight. Lift it up, pull it over, press it on, press down. I think I got this side quite as tight as it should be, but I think it'll be alright. So now your sandpaper's on there, ready to go. Alright, I am using Liquitex Basics acrylic gesso. Just comes, I get in a big gallon bottle, and I go through a lot of it. So that's what I use. So to start out, start on this one. This is where, choosing your brush is important. So for the first layer, I like it to go on really, really smooth. And if I'm working on a wood panel, like this one in the background, I will sand the wood first to make sure that the wood grain is pretty smooth. But on these masonite panels, you don't really need to do that. Alright, so for the first layer, I like to go really smooth. So I use my soft brush, really nice, thin bristles, so it's really smooth. It's not going to leave a lot of streaks in the gesso. And I like to use a little bit of water to thin it out a little bit, because this gesso can be kind of thick. So I like to thin it a little bit for the first layer. I don't do it after the first layer, just for the first layer, to make sure that it goes on evenly for the first layer. Put a little bit on there, and then I'll wet my brush and try to get it smooth. Got quite a lot on there, so I'm gonna put a little bit back in. So again, I want it to be thinner on the first layer. So all this extra, I'm actually gonna use another panel and spread it out over the next panel, because I don't want it too thick on my first layer. I really like it thin for the first layer, just to make sure that it has a nice even first layer. And I end up doing gessoing in batches for this reason, because I'll just pour it directly on the panel. So I end up doing quite a few panels at a time. which is nice because then I have a bunch ready to go. Try to keep it soft and smooth for the first layer. We are going to sand in between layers, but again, I just like to have it nice even, just so I know that my base layer is solid, even. Nice even coating. All right, so gotta let that dry. So again, this is what you can use the water for, is to keep your brush in so your brush doesn't dry out between layers. So I'm in the garage to do this. One thing I want to point out is that we will be sanding the gesso. So it is very important that when you're sanding gesso to be outside or in a place where you're not in your home. And it's also good to wear something over your nose and mouth. So I'm going to be going bandit style with a bandana over my nose and mouth to make sure that I don't breathe in any of that gesso dust. So Gesso is basically a plastic, and when you sand it, there's very fine particles that will get into the air, and you really don't want to be breathing that in, especially if you do this often. All right, so now that the layer's dry, nice and dry, I'm going to take my sanding block and I'm going to do a quick sand over the top of it so this will actually open up the gesso a little bit so that it will be easier for the next layer to adhere to it. Smooth. You can use a paper towel to wipe off all that dust that's on it. There's going to be a lot of extra dust. Get some of that extra dust off. Alright, so now that our brush has been sitting in the water waiting, we kind of want to dry it out a little bit. So we can use the same paper towel, get it kind of dried out. It doesn't have to be super dry. And we're going to put some more gesso on. And I always go opposite. So for the first layer, I went this way with all of my strokes. And now for the second layer, I'm going to go in the opposite direction for all of my strokes. I don't know if it's really necessary. I just like to do it. It kind of, in my mind, makes it a little bit more like the weave of canvas. So you're sort of like weaving the gesso together, and it evens out the streaks a little bit. So on the second layer, it's okay to go thicker. We don't need to thin it out, and we can definitely go thicker on the second layer. Now that it's got a nice even first base layer, we can go with our second layer a bit thicker. All right. Now I like to make sure that the strokes are even, so you can see there's like a little spot there where there's a brush mark. I like to make sure that the strokes go all the way across so that that doesn't interfere with, you know, something on my painting later. All right, now we're gonna let that dry. You wanna make sure that it's dry to the touch, so I'd give it half an hour, depends on, you know, where you are and how dry it is, but at least half an hour, maybe an hour, to make sure that it's totally dry, especially if it's a thicker layer like this. Might want to give it an hour to make sure it's totally dry. I do the exact same process for my larger panels, putting on a layer in one direction and then putting on the next layer in the opposite direction. This method also works exactly the same if you're painting on canvas or canvas panel. Bet you can't wait to see what this one's gonna be. You can see I'm using the other brush to pick out hairs that have fallen onto the gesso so they don't get stuck in there. Once this dries, it's really hard to get the hair out, so you want to make sure that any little pieces of lint, hair, or anything that's going to be a bump in the surface is not in it while it's drying. You want to make sure to sand before you put on the next layer of gesso, and repeat this process until you get 3 layers. I always do at least 3 layers, sometimes 4 if it doesn't look pure white. So that's the process to prepare a surface for oil painting, and you can do this on canvas, on glass. This even works on paper and cardboard. I would suggest not sanding at all if you're doing it on paper or cardboard. You don't want to risk ruining your surface. Thanks for watching. Thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more.